Is there a message of necessity at the desk? There is a message of necessity at the desk. Move to accept the message of necessity. The message is accepted.
Welcome to another episode of Messages of Necessity, brought to you by the Empire Center for Public Policy, a podcast where we talk about public policy issues in New York and sometimes are able to follow along with current events. With me this week is the research director for the Empire Center for Public Policy, Ken Girardin, and we are going to be talking about school budget season. Good afternoon, Ken.
Good afternoon, Cam. Happy post-budget season to you too.
So we had the budget votes last week. Were there any big takeaways that you had from them?
The biggest takeaway was that most budgets passed. The state over the past 12 years has had a pretty high record of budgets getting approved. In this most recent round, 97% of school budgets got approved. This is where about 670 districts, basically all the districts outside of the big five cities, go to the voters every May with their budget proposal for the next year and need to get majority approval for those plans. In the case of districts that are going to spend more than the tax cap allows, or I should say raise taxes more than the tax cap allows, they need to get 60% of voters instead of just a simple majority. But as we saw, more than 97% of budgets passed. Of the 32 that wanted to go over the tax cap, 22 out of those 32, so almost 70% of those budgets passed. So it was a pretty standard exercise in school budget votes. It wasn't like what we saw historically in the early 90s or especially in the late 70s where you saw 15, 20, or even 30% of budgets being voted down. So it shows kind of that the current system of letting folks approve their budgets with simple majorities, as long as they're not going over the tax cap, is working great. And it's showing that when districts want to override the tax cap, most of the time they're successful in making their case to the public.
So help me out here along with the others who live in districts where your school district yes vote is almost guaranteed. What were the specifics of the tax cap this year? How does it, we've been in this time of high inflation, so was it any different than previous years? What was the story with the tax cap itself?
The tax cap is an 11 or 12 part calculation for how much your levy, that is the total property tax collected by your district, is allowed to increase over the prior years, again, without you getting 60% of voters to sign off on it. And at the heart of it is an inflation factor, either the growth of the consumer price index or 2%, whichever is lower. Now, we had a number of years where inflation was below 2%. So we started with that lower CPI figure, but with inflation over 2%, as anybody who has driven past a grocery store can attest, with inflation over 2%, that's the basis of the calculation. And it varies by district because every district has their own tax cap, because other factors that come in there are things like, how much development was there in your school district over the past year? Because the tax cap is designed so as to not penalize growth. And if you're adding to your tax base, it makes sense that your property taxes are going to go up a commensurate amount. So the tax caps for districts on average wasn't 2%, it was closer to 3.3% ballpark. So those districts were able to increase their taxes up to that amount, and it could have been 4%, 5%, again, it depends on the district, with just a majority vote. But if they wanted to override and go higher, and there is no limit on how high they can go, if they wanted to go over their district's allotted tax cap, then they needed to get 60% of the vote.
So, and 3% is a pretty healthy increase when you look at the trends in enrollment in a lot of the districts throughout New York State. And it's, it seems like a pretty reasonable increase. Were there any notable results from the school board votes where budgets you would have thought should have passed did not pass, or budgets that should never have passed were passed?
To clarify something on the tax cap, the purpose of the tax cap is to keep the price of local government from going up faster than the price of everything else. And so, and it's meant to act as kind of the analogy that E.J. McMahon and I often use is that it's a speed limit. That is to say, you can theoretically go over the speed limit. Like if your wife is in labor, you can go over the speed limit to get to the hospital. Speed limit is not, we're not setting the laws of physics around school districts, but we are creating a higher standard for you going faster than the way things were before. Two districts that jump out are Ithaca, which is not exactly the epicenter of fiscal conservatism in upstate New York. Is that adequate understatement, Cam?
Yeah, that would be accurate from all reports.
It is it's the heart of Tompkins County, which is probably one of the most, politically one of the most left of center areas north of New York City in all of upstate. They voted down their budget. There was a proposal to increase taxes by more than 8%. There was a lot of local opposition. Their costs had really been ticking up in recent years, and they were looking to do this on top of state aid being at this unprecedentedly high level. That's one thing that's been going on in the background with all of these budget votes. You have these schools adopting spending plans where, yes, they're increasing property taxes up to the tax cap, and they're staying within the tax cap, but they are also getting just this unprecedented amount of funding. On average, school aid per student has doubled since 2012, from roughly $7,500 per student to about $15,000 per student. We can have another podcast about the prudence of that, the return on investment, and the sustainability of that approach. But districts like Ithaca that said this is too high, too fast. They said no. One that passed, and this was a property tax cap override vote, was in Horseheads. And the reason they stand out, that's a town outside Binghamton, or that's in a town outside Binghamton. One reason the Horseheads district stands out is because their board president saw our property tax report card review, our school budget spotlight, and issued a misleading statement saying that the district was only spending $18,000 per student. In reality, Horseheads was spending $28,000 per student. So we'll be having some words after this podcast about that, about the misrepresentations that happened in those districts and whether the state education department needs to be made aware about it. For instance, by an announcement on a podcast.
Yeah, I'm interested in how in the new math in Horseheads. So it sounds to me like the tax cap is working, that the speed limit is working, that school budgets seem to be reasonable. Large portions, such a large percentage of them actually passed, and the special voting requirement for going past the tax cap was met with regularity throughout the state. So why do I often hear about the tax cap spelling doom in New York and it needing to be reformed or repealed?
Doom and certain disaster. And the reason is exactly what we've explained in our writing on the tax cap, which is that you have a lot of districts going up to the limit and not further. That is to say, those are districts that would try to go higher, but don't want to go and meet that 60% standard. And the number one enemy of the property tax cap is the New York State United Teachers, the statewide teachers union. They view the property tax cap as the only thing standing between them and more hiring and more raises. The property tax cap completely changed the physics around school union contract negotiation, where NYSET for a long time their practice would be to let contract talks drag out, sometimes over a year, and then agree to retroactive pay raises, at which point you'd have some significant jump in the tax levy to pay for those. And what the property tax cap has done is shield superintendents from these demands for what NYSET lawyers would call new money in negotiations. And just as it's created certainty for homeowners and businesses on what their costs are going to be, the property tax cap has created certainty for superintendents for how much money is going to be in play in their negotiations. And they're not going to be looking at a situation where if they give in to NYSET demands, they have to go to the voters with an 8% or 9% tax increase, simply because that's not certain anymore. And that is the exact reason that NYSET is trying desperately to make the tax cap go away. They have done everything from litigation to getting lawmakers to put in bills to poke holes in the tax cap by creating new exclusions. Their biggest goal, arguably, is to go and get rid of the supermajority requirement. That is to say, require all budgets to only need a simple majority vote. At which point the tax cap becomes absolutely meaningless. It becomes a distinction without a difference. And the supermajority requirement has been crucial to slowing the growth of property taxes back down to the rate of inflation. Because as we saw prior to the tax cap, property tax levies were increasing at about twice the speed of inflation. Especially in the early 2000s, between 2002 and 2006, there were multiple years where the average property tax increase, the average was 7%. And I think 4 of those 5 years. So you had people routinely having their property taxes increase 30, 40, 50% over the course of just 5 years. And that is something that touches all sorts of all different parts of the economy. It touches the question of can older people on fixed incomes stay in their homes? Do business development, does new housing development get built? Do new industrial projects get built? Because there's so much uncertainty about how much your property taxes are going to go up, 15 years out or 20 years out. And the certainty that's come from the property tax cap has helped New York with getting housing built. It's helped New York with old people staying in their homes and aging in place. It's been a real win-win-win for all of the people we're fond of calling stakeholders in the education process.
So that said, there's 2 weeks left or so in the regular session. Finishing June 6th or so. Is there anything you're hearing about the tax cap and what's any attempts to weaken it or take it away in the last 2 weeks of session?
The property tax cap, unfortunately, is always in danger. And that's why it's important for listeners to understand just how much the property tax cap has saved them personally, how much it's saved people in their community, and how much it's forced school boards to make more prudent choices and more sustainable choices and try to get a better value for their dollar rather than just turning to the taxpayers as an endless well of revenue.
Well, let's change the topic slightly to not saving money and get to a pet peeve of mine, which is another aspect of almost every school vote in May of every year, which is transportation, school bus propositions, and in recent years, electric school buses. I live in a district that's an early adopter that was able to get some money from the Volkswagen diesel settlement for its first round of buses, and then paid a premium for another round of buses. And this year put forward a proposition contingent on getting grant monies from either the EPA or NYSERDA. So as an early adopter, they're looking to get buses in place by 2025 in order to get ahead of a 2035 electric school bus mandate. I'm going to vent here on the fact that these school buses have about a 10-year lifespan, so we are paying a premium and the state is subsidizing electric school buses in my district to a large extent for buses that will be obsolete before they're mandatory. That proposition passed in my district on the promise that if the grants don't come in, this district's going to limit itself to just buying 3 diesel buses, even though that's not what the proposition said. And my lawyer's ears perked up to that. But regardless, what happened around the rest of the state on electric school bus propositions?
We saw a few dozen electric school bus propositions. The bulk of them passed. We didn't see a lot of districts doing this, and this is notable because beginning in 2027, that this is going to be the only thing that school districts can buy. So, like you said, Cam, some districts are trying to get ahead of that, trying to get the charging infrastructure in place. one of the discoveries in all of this, besides seeing that the electric buses are 2.5 to 4 times the cost of the diesel, the current diesel and gas buses, is that they come with a lot of infrastructure needs. Not only do you need the charging base stations yourself, but some districts are finding out that they need to make upgrades to the local electric grid, sometimes as far as needing a new substation installed in order to get the amount of electricity that you need to charge sometimes a couple hundred buses overnight. That's a lot of juice coming in, and it's not something that you can just tap into the grid at your leisure. So the school districts that have been trying to get ahead, it was just a handful in the grand scheme of things of districts trying for it. It's interesting that most of them passed, but we have been seeing a string of instances where these are defeated presumably because local folks are getting sticker shock at this. And as we get to 2027, we're going to see a real test of the state's home rule system, because if districts can't get their voters to go along with these exceptional costs for bus electrification, the state's going to have one of two choices. They can ease the mandate, delay it, or they can take away the public's right to vote on these capital projects, which is a pretty cherished right and kind of central to the form of pluralism on which we run local school districts. So it's going to be really tough to see. Either way, the state is going to be in a really tough situation going forward if school bus costs don't come down significantly. And unfortunately, in the last round of bidding that I wrote about back in January, we actually saw prices ticking up, at least in nominal terms, for every model that the state was trying to help districts purchase.
Yeah, just for perspective, in my district, there are the voters also approved a proposition to start setting aside up to $15 million in order to be paying for electric school buses going forward. So this is already envisioned as being a very significant expense for school districts.
And school districts aren't supposed to be primarily in the transportation business, and that's where we start to have to worry about the crowding out effects. One other thing I'll say about the electric school bus mandate is that this is kind of, not to use the cliche, but this really is the tip of the iceberg on state climate policy. And the reason we're getting such a clear read on it is because superintendents need to plan years ahead. And unlike all the other parts of the state's climate targets for 2030, this is a place where the superintendents have gone and charted the cost and practical considerations for getting from A to B. And the reason we're seeing these price tags north of $8 billion for this move, there are all sorts of other big chunks of the state's climate policy that are going to have similarly, if not considerably larger costs, but for which the state is not going and doing those sorts of out-year projections, which were promised at the time when the climate targets were set in 2019.
Yeah, and just for some perspective on this, because it is, again, my pet issue, I think NYSERDA has allocated $100 million in grants this year for electric school bus subsidies, and the premium is at least $200,000 per bus just for the vehicle. Forget about the charging infrastructure, which they apparently also have other grant programs for. But we're talking about being able to subsidize 500 buses for more than 600 school districts around the state. The math just doesn't add up, and the sooner people realize that maybe the better.
And where can, pray tell, do NYSERDA grants come from? Is there a NYSERDA grant mine somewhere in Herkimer County? Is there a NYSERDA grant fountain somewhere in rural Rensselaer County on the Nassau Plateau?
No, it would be the taxpayers. And in addition, let's not forget that these more expensive buses also then part of the sales pitch to districts is the fact that there is state aid on these buses that at a higher amount. So the taxpayers are subsidizing at a higher rate electric school buses in the districts that are the early adopters versus diesel or propane, for instance. And
for the record, I like the electric buses. CDTA has one of their jumbo buses is electric. It's quieter. It smells nicer. But when we come back to the fundamental question, that is to say the rule of law, where the state was supposed to be doing these sorts of cost estimates and feasibility studies with its climate initiatives, and we still haven't seen it 5 years later, then we've got a pretty good cause to be belly aching about it.
Yes, I'll leave it at this. I would not turn down a Tesla if somebody wanted to give it to me right now. The economics in my house don't work otherwise, and that's maybe one way of thinking about it. So well, I guess we'll wrap it up there. This has been another episode of Messages of Necessity. Please, wherever you get us, find us and rate us, and so that we can get the word out to more. And with that, thank you for listening.
For more news and analysis, visit our website and sign up for email updates at empirecenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn @Empire Center.